Hi everybody, this is Tony again. We are now in Malta attending CLC 2025, and next to me is Sid, our YCLA co-chair. Hello Sid, say hello to our audience from Hong
Hi.
Kong.
Hi, hi, young lawyers and lawyers from Hong Kong.
So we have a few questions that we would like to ask Sid to address, and let's start. Well, Sid, we'd like to ask you about some of your views about industry future and personal growth. If you could give one piece of advice to your younger self at the start of your career, what would it be?
I think when I started my law practice back in 2015, I think I started directly from the Supreme Court. And I think that while it was very fascinating to see the most important cases being argued and assisting my senior in those cases, but I felt that when a case is actually prepared is a trial court. So I think rather than starting from Supreme Court, if I want to be in litigation, if I could go back in time, I would work with a firm which is practicing before the trial court and handling trial, because I think handling trial helps you to understand how different clientele uh, to understand different clients, their requirements, how law is made, how judges think, and what leads a case to ultimately land up in Supreme Court. So I think if I could go back in time, I would spend a year or two with a firm which is primarily working in trial court. So that's the advice that I would like to give myself. I mean, because monetarily, and especially the jurisdiction I come from, monetarily it's very difficult choice to make to start from trial court. But I think if you're looking at a longer plan, if you want to start career as a litigation lawyer, I think trial court is the best place to start your career from.
Hmm. Okay, and number 6. Then next we'll go to education and skills. Are there any specific skills that you find crucial but were not covered in your formal education? I mean, like legal education.
I think I would say that in respect of that when I was studying the undergraduation, the education that I was having, it was not addressing. I think they focus more on completing the course than actually translate that idea behind the course into action that you understand the law. But when I went for my master's to study comparative constitutional law in Central European University, I think there when I met the professors and the way they were, because law is a subject which is very philosophical driven. So the way you understand any particular subject is something that you really understand it deeply. Like for example, I mean, dignity was only understand its literal sense. But when I was studying the courses in constitutional law about dignity, what it meant, and how it has been translated into different judgments to make you understand as a lawyer that what it really means to be a lawyer while representing your client before the court. That's one thing that I feel that was there. And secondly, I feel that formal education should also focus on exposing you to the real practice of law, because when you read the law and you should be made to see the disparity which exists, because there are problems with regard to backlogs, there are problems with regard to pendency of cases, then adjournments that take place which delays the whole trial. So I feel that one of the things that can also be included in the teaching of formal education is understanding the law from the practical experience. I think these two things which I can right now think of are most important for me. If I go back in law school, I would be very excited if I'm told this is how the real law works.
And how about AI? Like recently, everyone is talking about AI, and seems to be AI is transforming the legal industry a lot. How do you think it's something that lawyers should be equipped with certain skills to cope with this transformation?
I think I will just quote a quotation that I read somewhere very recently, where it says that AI will not replace humans,
Yeah.
but humans who use AI will replace humans who don't. So I think that AI is important because anything that reduces human effort is a machine. So AI should be used because people may resist it. I mean, there are ethical issues concerning it. I think AI should be used, not abused.
Yeah.
Like you should use it to make an argument, but you should not make an argument from it as a lawyer. And I think when it is helping you to understand, like if a judge is there, a judge has a screen before him, so you can automatically transfer the judgment. Like what I've seen in my years of practicing law, there was a time when you would go to the photocopier, print all the judgments, like there will be thousands of pages, and if you're arguing before a judge bench which contains 7 or 8 judges or 7 or 9 judges, then you would have to get a printout of for all the judges, the other side. So I think in that scenario, AI has come to a great use to people, because now you can immediately transfer it before the judge. You can refer the paragraphs, and I think to assist you in drafting, AI is of great help. And I think it becomes so easier with the fact that it becomes so easier these days to practice law, because we have an AI system machine that is going to assist you. But I think AI should not be completely used, because I think I was recently speaking at an event where we were discussing that always practice law and decision making in the legal practice should not be done by a machine, but it should only be done under the supervision of a machine. So I think there is a AI Act 2024 which passed by the European Parliament, which says that AI should be used, but it should be used under human supervision. So I think because AI is a field which is still evolving, there are many things in law that helps you. And like I'll give you an example. In India, like we can directly like I'm sitting here, but I can appear in Indian court from here online, and there is increasingly admission of the fact that you can appear online, you can argue your case. I have my file which is uploaded in the court's website, so I can refer to my pages, which is the court file. So I think that's how. So I think AI has been made very useful for lawyer to practice. So because I think as a legal professional, one of the things that I used to feel when I was growing in this profession, when a budding lawyer, I used to feel that this profession actually restricts you. You have to wake up every day, go to the same court, argue, and like doctors, you see the physically patients. You can't go outside because that is your court. I think AI has changed it. Now you can actually be anywhere in the world. You have your file, you argue, and sometimes the judges like it. Sometimes they think, okay, we are sitting here every day, and this guy is in somewhere in the world. But I think it should be accepted that lawyers should be allowed to argue from anywhere, and if they're required physically, then I think they should argue physically.
Thank you. Let's go to the final question, and it will be about global legal issues. Are there any global legal issues you feel particularly passionate about?
I think one of the subjects which is very close to my heart, like you do your criminal law, commerce law, commercial law, but I think constitution has always been something which I have been very passionate about. And one of the things which have been very close to my heart is the power of the implied limitation on the power of the parliament to amend constitution. I've written about it. I've written about the fact that how it affects in African region, and in Asia, in Latin America, Africa, because I've written about it so much. And the reason why is that I started to work under the first senior at bar. He was the instrumental person to have given us what is called the basic structure theory, where the Indian Supreme Court, for the first time, being any court, recognized that there are limitations on the power of the parliament. So in India, anything could have been amended, but they say that now, because the parliament is the creation of the constitution, so is the judiciary. Therefore, parliament cannot go beyond the constitution. So every act of the parliament is subject to judicial review, and the court will review it to mean that whether the act of the parliament has gone beyond constitutional limits or not. So I think I write about it regularly, and I'm very passionate about it. And I think if I get time on my shoulders, I would love to write about it, like the theory of limitation on amendment power throughout the Commonwealth.
I remember that you talk about some of the Ugandan experience, because you did some constitutional law research on that area as well. Can you share more about it?
So yeah, I mean in Uganda, like that is the issue. Like if I'll compare it. Like we have Kenya and Uganda. So Kenya recently said that they wanted to bring in a law which was which could have entirely done away with the old constitution and brought in new, and they wanted to say that they were economically changing the country to progress. But in Kenya, there's an interesting provision of law that you need to collect signature of some amount of person, like 100,000 probably, to initiate a constitutional amendment. So that was not done. So they said because there is a law that requires public participation, and since a law has been brought in to do away with the constitutional structure, which requires you to have public participation, because public participation is not there in the government plans, therefore it is unconstitutional. So they read the constitution to mean something that you cannot amend the constitution to that extent that you do away with the requirement of public participation. But if you look in Uganda, they said that parliament is supreme, so there cannot be limitation on their power, because how can you judicially review it? And it all originated in India, because if I can give you a background, what happened in India, if we have time. So in India, what happened, that they started the constitution, and in the beginning, because we wanted to bring in a lot of laws and social revolutionary, so we had right to property. Laws were challenged on the ground that they are violative of your right to get property. And in India, it was a law that right to property was a fundamental right. So whenever a law was brought in to take over the control of the land belonging to private persons, it was challenged before the court, and the court struck it down on the ground that it is a law, and a law cannot be violative of fundamental right. Therefore, if you're taking the law property from the person, it is violative of their rights. So they brought in a constitutional amendment to say that whatever legislation would be put in a schedule which was inserted in the constitution, that will not be subject to judicial review on the ground that it is violative of fundamental right, because those laws are brought in to for the acquiring, for public public purpose. So then the law was distinguished that the law which was made by the parliament, that is a law, but this is a constitutional amendment, therefore it's a constitutional law. So there's a distinction between law and constitutional law. Therefore a constitutional law could do things in order to achieve the principle of eminent domain. So I think India has been a country which have originated this theory. Some countries have adopted it, some countries have denied it. But I think if I could get a chance, like if you ask me how passionate I am about it, so if I can get a chance, I will write about this theory across the Commonwealth. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the interview, and thank you so much, and then I'll enjoy the rest of the day.
Yeah.